Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Goin Digital Show, the podcast for K-12 school leaders. I'm your host, Greg Goins, and this is episode number 17. Tonight, we're going to talk all about classroom redesign. I want to welcome our live viewers on the TeachCal Broadcasting Network at teachcal.com. And if you want to ask a question or share comments with our guest tonight, you can participate always by using the EduLive hashtag. If you can't make the live show tonight, you can always find the Goin Digital Show on demand on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher Radio. So let's get to it with our very special guest tonight. We have with us, right now we have two outstanding guests. We're hoping to add a third here shortly, but we have Bob Dillon, the Director of Technology of the Afton School District in the St. Louis, Missouri area. And we also have Ben Gilpin, an outstanding elementary principal from the state of Michigan. And both of these gentlemen are very popular speakers, bloggers, and education consultants that are committed to creating innovative schools. We're hoping also to have Erin Klein on tonight, an outstanding advocate for the Reimagine Schools effort, and her expertise is classroom redesign, as is our other two guests tonight. So we're hoping to have a good conversation about how we can think a little bit differently about designing 21st century classrooms. So welcome to the show, guys.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Greg. It's winding down, but it's good to be on the air tonight.
Well, we're very excited to have you here and very excited to learn about some of the innovative things you've been doing in your school district and some of the things you're talking about throughout the country. So, Bob, let's start with you a little bit. Let's tell us a little bit about your school district and what does it actually mean to be a director of innovation?
Yeah, thanks. The Afton School District is about 2,500 kids, K-12. Kind of buried here in St. Louis County. I always say that I'm about 8 miles from the Arch, just to give people some perspective about where we are. About a year and a half ago, we embarked on a journey to rethink our learning spaces. And we had an opportunity to work with a really great designer and educator, her name being Rebecca Hare, who has worked really closely with me on this project. And we just started having conversations. We can dig into that a little bit more. But my job as Director of Innovation really started as a Director of Technology role. And what I realized more and more of what I was doing was solving systems problems in the district and not just technology issues. Everything from how do we get money to the food service people? How do we solve field trip forms for our Director of Transportation? So finally decided that really what I was doing was about innovating systems and not just taking care of the technology. So it made sense, it fit, and so I've been wearing it ever since.
Oh, great. Ben, tell us about your background.
Okay. Well, let's see. I have been a elementary principal now for 6 years. Prior to that, I was a 5th grade teacher for 9 years, so roughly 15, 16 years in education. And I guess as I came over to Warner Elementary, I started out pretty slow. First year or so, we did some minor things, but it was more about me building relationships and really getting to know people, getting to know the community, and getting to see some of the strengths that were here at Warner Elementary. Then probably the second and third year, I started to work with some different teachers about trying to innovate spaces. Because I was seeing some innovative practice. We were creating more choice, we were creating more voice, but their spaces didn't necessarily match up. And one of the things that I said a long time ago to people was, if you went into a classroom and you just saw a pretty plain room with desks and rows, and you saw 10 of those rooms, wouldn't you imagine that probably 8 or 9 out of 10 are probably not going to be innovative? They're going to be pretty traditional classrooms. You may have 1 or 2 that's innovative in a very traditional setting. Can we have our spaces start to match up with our teaching? And that was like step number 1. Step number 2 was getting some teachers to go out and check out Leader in Me schools. And if you've ever been to a Leader in Me school, they are full of pictures, and not only pictures but colors, and trying to really get people to see some leadership qualities. I had teachers come back and they were charged up, and then it was just simply this, Greg. It was about me getting out of the way. It was about me supporting them and saying yes and getting out of their way. So that's a little bit about how we kind of got started. And at this point now, for me, it's I try to do quite a bit with our technology group, McCull. I'm also involved in our elementary principal group that's in the state, MEMSPA, and I'm just pretty darn busy, especially with my own 2 kids and my busy wife.
And this idea of redesigning classrooms and thinking about doing something different with learning spaces, I mean, this has been around for a little while, but for a lot of folks, it's still a very fresh idea. A lot of people are just now starting to gravitate toward the idea of flexible seating and those kind of things. Bob, when did you really see a shift, and when did you really start seeing schools take this idea seriously and start to make some positive changes?
Yeah, that's a good question, Greg. I was a middle school principal for 15 years, and the last few of those years I worked at a school that was an expeditionary learning school, where we spent about 25% of the school year either outside, out in the community, or outside of the community. And to me, I quickly learned what it took to have kids excited and engaged. I wanted to make sure we were doing that inside the classroom as well. And so when I had a chance to do that at Afton, we had an old computer lab that we were ready to make a symbol of the past. And that's where we started. We started by gutting that room and starting to think about what the optimal things were that could kind of be a showplace for the rest of the teachers to come and say, hey, I may like to try a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And that room kind of became the central hub kind of for our learning space design changes going on in Afton.
Ben, what about you?
Even back to the days when I was a classroom teacher, I think it started with, and I think teachers have always thought that collaboration and teamwork have been a good thing. Goodness, I even remember being a student years and years ago, and my teachers tried to put me in teams and tried to get me to work with other people. So I think that the idea and the concept has been around for a long time, but the resources have changed. I mean, the flexible seating is a big one that you mentioned, but it's also about, opening up spaces. Sometimes the biggest faux pas, so to speak, is going into a classroom and seeing too much stuff. And I've learned a lot from Erin Klein on that aspect. She's taught me quite a bit about less is more, especially on the walls, which to me is critical. So I think it's the more I've been in education, the more I've learned, and I think everybody has always thought collaboration is a good thing, but figuring out what colors are best, figuring out that less can be more, and then having flexibility and even something as simple as the light fixtures. I mean, those are some big deals that we're learning more and more about the longer that we're in education.
And we have Erin Klein joining us, and Erin is an award-winning teacher, speaker, author, and blogger from the state of Michigan. She's also one of the leading voices on learning spaces and creating 21st century classrooms. And Erin, we're talking a little bit tonight about just this idea of when did people actually start embracing this idea of changing what our classrooms look like.
I'm so excited to be here, so thank you. I apologize for being a little bit late. We had lacrosse this evening for my daughter, so just kind of walking in the door. I think it's really important that we make these big changes, but I honestly feel what brought these changes about, it really didn't come from teachers, and it didn't come from educators wanting to make this big difference. I think it came from really in-tune teachers listening to their students and their populations, and I honestly think, at least for me, and people who I've worked alongside, that it's come from the students themselves. We've just recognized a difference in our student population and how they learn, and we've tried to accommodate their needs best as possible. And when you actually talk to the students and get their voice involved, you'll very quickly understand that, number one, they want a space that's comfortable, and that they want a space to where they can really collaborate and talk with one another. So when we design those flexible seating environments and really make things brain friendly for them, I think that those are the key components, and it really just kind of drives what we do as teachers and has led us to kind of dig deeper into the research components.
And I think back to my own personal journey and trying to learn a little bit more about classroom design, and I really discovered Erin and Ben both on the website Classroom Cribs, which I thought was a very innovative idea to kind of get people excited about changing this idea of a traditional classroom. And Erin's talked a lot about why can't classrooms look more like a Barnes and Noble and a more fun environment. Ben, can you talk to me a little bit about the Classroom Cribs website and kind of what the goal was when you started that?
Absolutely. I remember the conversation well. It was, I believe it was July of a couple of years ago, and AJ Giuliani, who is also part of the book as well, couldn't join us tonight, but shout out to AJ. He has been phenomenal throughout the entire process. AJ, Erin, and I actually had this conversation. We were trying to look at it from different lenses. Obviously, AJ more on the tech side, and Erin from the classroom perspective, and I was more the administrative look. So really, that was where we started off that conversation. We were thinking, we want to give some resources to teachers, because how many teachers are really craving to look at what other classrooms look like? I for one, we have a traveling staff meeting, and every Friday or every other Friday when we have these traveling staff meetings, the comments from teachers are always, "I never knew you had that," or "Oh, check that out," or "That's such a cool idea." And that's in our own building. So to be able to open that up and to give teachers resources, to give them grant opportunities, to give them open looks at other classrooms was really a big goal in the beginning. And it's gone pretty well, I think. We had a lot of success that first year. We saw some really cool classrooms. We've got them on the website. AJ has really been instrumental with the website, so I've got to give him a lot of credit with that. But the idea really stemmed from the three of us just talking about trying to give more resources to teachers. I'm hoping that Erin can add to that as well.
Sure, Erin?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Ben. It started from AJ's kind of idea of, hey, do you remember MTV Cribs, and how amazing was it to be able to kind of take that peek into celebrities' homes and get those design tips for your own house, but on a dime budget, right? So we really wanted to do that with classrooms as well, so that individuals around the country could just get real ideas, but not from what they'd see in a staged magazine, or not from what they would see from a technology distributor and this big dream classroom, but actual practitioners in real life, day to day, doing amazing things with their classroom, but not making it that Pinterest pretty classroom either. I think that is essential to mention, because it's really focused on the learning first and the learner and the outcomes of sound pedagogical practices, as opposed to let's just throw some chevron on the wall, when we all know that can be quite distracting, even though I'm personally a fan. It's just not good for students.
Yeah, and the reality.
I think
sorry.
Go ahead. And I was going to say, Dr. Dillon, Bob, was a great help on the project as well in terms of the book, and we brought him onto the website as well, of course. But I think just collectively adding all of the different facets from our backgrounds has really just kind of made it an all-encompassing website, not just for classroom teachers, but also like Ben, the administrative perspective, AJ, the tech director's perspective, and Bob kind of does it all, but at a much larger level from the district and beyond. So.
Great. And Bob, I want to move to you. Tell us a little bit about the process of writing the book. How did you become involved? And what I guess in a collaborative fashion, how did the four of you work together and really generate the idea to create the book?
Wait a second, time out. Bob was the glue. So before he jumps in, let's just say that Bob was the glue. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, thank you, Ben.
Good segue.
But Ben, ultimately, I think that am I doing okay here? I thought it blocked up there for a second.
I don't see you, but I can hear you, so you're fine.
Sounds good. I think that it is a challenge to bring four busy educators together to try to figure out a way to make a coherent voice in a book. And I think I leaned heavily on my background as a journalist and a journalism teacher and a high school English teacher to kind of thread that together. We had a lot of expertise in the room. We had a lot of folks that knew the topic, and we were just able to kind of see the thread that held all this together. And it really turned out to be a really great book. And so I'm most excited to have teachers, principals take a look at it and start to think differently. And so,
Ben, we may have lost him there. Can you pick up from?
There he is.
There you are. Are you back, Bob?
A lot of success in my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Ben, tell me about the collaborative process and how you went about doing that.
Well, in the beginning, this started out, and I remember the conversation very well. There was a lot of similarities between the book and Classroom Cribs, and the whole idea initially was to put together a resource that almost any educator could pick up, and they could gain something from. That was the initial. The longer we did it, the more we were trying to really centralize and have it be more specific to the teacher lens, but it could also be beneficial to an administrator or someone in the tech field. But it's really most specific to a teacher, because we were just finding that there were parts of it that maybe were a little bit scattered, so we had to kind of centralize. And I think that eventually we could even do some different routes in the future. But the goal, I think, in the beginning was really to have each one of us share our journeys and how we can specifically speak to people about what could their next step be. So for me, how am I going to talk to how am I going to talk to a principal or an administrator? Instead of being the blockade, how can we create more of a culture of yes? Erin was going to talk specifically with how's the design going to work, and how can I work with, and how can I speak to teachers? So everybody had their little niche, and that we were going to be really rolling that out to people. I got to say that through the process and finding out people's barriers, sometimes you find out people's barriers, and sometimes the book starts to write itself. And one thing, and this has stood out to me from the beginning of this process, over and over and over again, I kept hearing people say that the fire marshal was a blockade, was a barrier. And I know that that's going to sound comical, but the amount of people that said that, it became from a comical line to that's a reality. And trying to figure out, how do you work with a fire marshal? How do you work with someone on your administrative team, or possibly even a superintendent that likes to have the walls white? And how do you really make that work? So, that was really part of the process, trying to figure out a resource for people that everybody could learn from and take from and say, this is how I'm going to get started. And that was really ultimately the goal.
And it's interesting you bring up the story about the fire marshal, because it's always easy to find obstacles. There's always a million reasons to say no. And one of the things that we've kind of talked about in my area as we talk about things like learning spaces and flexible seating, one of the questions I often get is, will the state allow us to complete state testing in this type of environment? There's this perception that it has to be traditional, you're at your desk, straight rows, and to my knowledge, there are no restrictions in taking state tests in a flexible seating environment. Bob, have you ever heard that?
No, that's a little bit of a surprise, but I'm surprised this time every year when all kinds of crazy rules about having to cover up things on the walls and take things down out of the hallways. So it doesn't surprise me at all. But you know what? If you have a trusting culture in your building with your kids, and they're going to take the test serious, then they're going to do it in whatever conditions you put them. And ultimately, probably perform better if they're comfortable. And so isn't that what we truly want, our kids to perform optimally? And so maybe that should be the focus as opposed to worrying about cheating.
Going back to obstacles, we've talked about a few. In your experience in working with teachers and school districts, what is that fear factor? I mean, what does it come down to? I mean, a lot of times I hear, well, we don't have the money to create a room that looks like Erin Klein's. But, what is the big obstacle that you have to face as you try to help school districts, Ben?
Well, and I think Bob, you have been in a lot more districts, but I'm just going to start it off, and I'm hoping that you'll pick it up from here. But I hear space, I hear money, and I hear restrictions by administrators. There's a set standard that we're not going to paint our walls, and we want the desks to stay in place. So I would say that those would probably be the top three. How much space do you have, how much money, and your administrator. Bob, I'm hoping that you can add to that.
There's something hidden under the surface because folks that have weaknesses in their teaching get further exposed when classroom space design is flexible. So weaknesses get amplified in those spaces. And so not everybody is in that mindset of like, that's okay, I'll figure it out, I'll grow into that space. There's a fear that some weaknesses are going to be brought out. When you're not standing in front of a classroom, when you aren't used to controlling your classroom through means other than compliance, some of that stuff gets amplified. So there's some fear that's hidden under the surface, but I would agree with Ben saying that money and space and systems and rules get in the way. But I mean, there's all too many places that are figuring out how to get past those barriers. Mm-hmm. The biggest barrier is that it has to then match your teaching, and I think you said that at the very beginning, Ben, is that if you can't change a space, then hope that will change teaching instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And Erin, this is a lot more than just bringing some bean bags in and trying to find using some crates for flexible seating or changing the color on the wall. You talk about brain-friendly classrooms. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that. I think it is far more important than that. We have to really think about what is it that we're going to change pedagogically speaking. And when I listen to Aaron Sams and John Bergman speak about, even the flipped classroom, one of the very first things that they will talk about is that traditional environments only reinforce traditional teaching and learning. So you really have to think about not only your space, but what is it that you want to do differently? Why is there a need for this change? Not just because, I'm going to jump on the bandwagon of classroom design, or it's summertime, I want to redesign my room. But you really have to think about the makeup of your classroom. There's not been a single year in my entire teaching career that my room has looked identical and it's never finished in September when the kids enter. Because I haven't yet met my students or my clients per se. So we really help design the room based on who the students are. And I think that that's really important for teachers to remember. And, being obsessive compulsive and really wanting everything to look great for when people walk in, that's really been hard for me personally to let go. But I think that's what's really comforting when I go around and I work with districts is, giving them that permission to not be polished, to not be perfect when students enter the door, because teaching and learning should be messy. It should be student-centered. It should be hands-on. And the students should really be at the center of everything that we do, because there's one of us in the room and how many of them. And I think so often that's very much flipped. So for me, a brain-friendly classroom environment, it starts with who are your students, what are their learning needs, what are their learning styles, how do they learn best. But there definitely are some foundational kind of norms that people could follow. For example, less is more, less environmental print on the wall, bringing things down to eye level. Susan Kovalik speaks a lot about that in her research in terms of not putting things too high, really making sure that it's eye level for the learner, and not creating this permanent wallpaper on the wall to where it becomes distracting, or when you do need to utilize or access it for learning, it doesn't stand out because it blends in with everything else that's been there since September, and now it's May. So I think that, lighting plays a key factor, making sure things like Ben mentioned color in the beginning are more monochromatic and less busy or distracting or overstimulating. Carnegie Mellon has a lot of research on that as well, about overstimulating environments and how they can really distract today's learners, especially when classroom sizes increase and there are more students in the room, etc. So I think that it's really important to get to know your students and get to know their needs, but really just to make sure that you're looking at your curriculum as well and seeing that it's all really a good fit for what you want to do. And it's not just, I'm going to change my classroom design this year and that's going to be the one fixed solution. You really have to think a multi-tiered approach to everything that you're doing, starting foundationally with the classroom learning environment, knowing your class list and what their strengths and areas of opportunity are, and talking to the teachers the previous year who had the students, but then most importantly, getting to know your students those first 2-3 weeks of school and asking them what they want in their space and co-creating it together, because it's not this perfect situation that you need to have ready ahead of time.
Bob?
Yeah, we cannot get the students involved with this fast enough, and I bet if Ben went back and did his process where he changed the hallways and bathrooms, and I know he surprised the students with that, but it would have been a great element to have, the student council or having a group of students with that. So I think that we fall into that trap that this is a process for school board members, community members, and architects, when really you have to drive the students to the center of this. And you absolutely can do this on a budget. The work we did in Afton, we were transforming, classrooms for $700, $1,000. We were transforming larger spaces for, $3,500. It didn't mean we were buying furniture that was going to last for 10 years, but it did mean that we were buying some things that were really functional in that space, and we were okay with that. It's not about building showrooms, and so I think that's really important.
Ben, what are your thoughts on the brain-friendly classroom?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Erin just brought up colors, less is more, the lighting, all of those things really matter. And Bob just hit on the fact, involving students in the process. When I think about brain-friendly, a lot of things that I think about, so many students nowadays need to move. They need to have flexibility. The classrooms where I see a lot of success are where students have the ability to move, and whether it's a standing desk, we have some classrooms that have quite a bit of those standing desks, whether it's open space. But I do think that not only does and Bob touched on this too, not only does your space need to be brain friendly and flexible and be able to have kids have the ability to move, but you've also got to have that as your teaching approach too. So you have to get out of the sage on a stage role. You've got to, as a teacher, you've got to move as well. Proximity matters and movement matters. So, brain friendly to me, I guess what it ultimately comes down to is having your teaching approach match up with the space. But it also involves all those elements of colors, less is more, lighting, flexibility. It's all of that stuff. It's the total package.
Yeah, and Greg, the other piece I would put in there has to do with being respectful of our introverts. We do know as we make these classrooms even more dynamic and moving that it's calling on kids to be collaborative. But we also do need to leave space for kids to reflect, kids to work alone, kids to have some time for quiet. And I think that, as we take libraries and make them noisier places, and that's probably a good thing, we can't totally discount the need to have spaces for quiet.
And as we continue to have the conversation about, focusing the curriculum on the 4 C's of communication, collaboration, critical thinking, those type of things, how does that factor into what schools should look like in the 21st century, Ben? Oh,
goodness, isn't that what we're looking for? Every classroom to have have that type of an atmosphere. I guess I would take a second, Greg, and I would just say to people that are in that process where they want to make some changes and they want to have more of the 4 C's. It doesn't have to be all at once. It doesn't have to be, if you're on a tight budget, if you're limited in resources, you got to find some place to start. So first of all, change the way you teach, and that would be first and foremost. Maybe it's just a unit that you're going to change. But then the second thing is, could you find some place in your classroom? Could you find a reading nook? Could you find a writing center? And could you redesign some type of a space like that that really can start to energize your students, energize you? And I think that, to me, we talk about the 4 C's, but for some people, I think that's a goal that they want, but they also don't know where to start. And I encounter a lot of teachers that the barriers really weigh them down, and the common question I get is, where do I start this? How do I start this? Yeah. And I think that's just a realistic issue that a lot of educators face.
The suggestion that I've been giving to principals is go to Walmart and buy 8 6-foot tables. that are folding tables and take all the desks out of one of your rooms and just see what it feels like. You don't have to leave it there more than a day or two, but give it a run and see what the kids think and see what that teacher thinks. And if that doesn't work in that classroom, take them to another classroom and try. For a teacher, you're talking about a $50, $60 investment, and then you're bound and determined to find one of your parents that can store your desks somewhere. I've always heard that from people too. Well, what are we going to put 25 desks if we put them out? I don't know. Someone has a storage unit. Go put them there, right? There's a place for them to be. That can't be the barrier. And, I think the other piece is about hallways, and I think that matters. I actually had a chance to be in some schools in Alabama last week, and I was in the hallway of the elementary school in Mountain Brook, and they had a cool, maker nook in the hallway, and I was just thinking, a quarter to a third of all square footage in a school is hallways. We've got to find a way to use those in a better way. So this may not be about classroom design so much as it is learning space design, and we have to be a little more creative how we define that and think about that.
And Erin, a question that I really have for you, and I guess everyone tonight, I know that a lot of teachers will send you pictures or videos and say, hey, this is what my classroom looks like, and can you get your magic wand out and tell me what to do next? What is that conversation like, and how do you really kind of talk them through getting started?
I think the first question I always have is, what is your need? And usually it starts with a problem. What didn't work out so well this year for you? Or what did you and your students kind of have as a roadblock? What would you like to improve for next year? And I think that once you have a need, then you can kind of start to iron out where to go from there. And of course, looking at pictures and stuff, it helps. And if teachers want kind of that bigger picture redesign, they really want to start everywhere, I caution them, because that can be overwhelming. I love how Ben mentioned earlier, start small. Do you want to do a classroom library? Do you want to do just a redesign of your flexible seating? What is it really that you want to accomplish? And I think just kind of talking with someone first and finding out, because we all have different needs, we all have different student populations, we all have just different everything. So I don't think that there's this one-stop fix, that's going to be a magic wand and fix everyone's solutions. But just like Bob mentioned earlier too, you can't create barriers for yourself. If you want there to be excuses, you're not going to accomplish anything. So if you want to move forward, you have to remove those barriers, and you have to find a way to get to yes. There can't be, oh, well, what about this? What about this? We can't continue to make excuses. So I think once you have an idea in mind of what you want to do, you kind of have to figure out how to get there with a really positive attitude, because mindset does matter.
And I love the fact that you talk about your classroom looks different year to year, maybe even month to month or semester to semester, and the kids really play a pivotal role in what your classroom's going to look like. And we always talk about the fact that the classroom doesn't necessarily belong to the teacher, it belongs to the kids. So you really need to have that mindset when you begin the process. Can you talk about that a little bit, Erin?
Sure. And, people often say, well, you've got such a large space, or I don't have the money, or how did you get approval for all of that? But honestly, a lot of my space used to be a music room, so it was really long and narrow. And when people come to visit my classroom, which many people have, it's really impressive to hear them say, oh my gosh, your room's smaller than mine is. Yours looks so big online. And I always tell them, oh gosh, it must just be the angle of the camera. But my room, in terms of square footage, is actually very small, but it's really how you utilize the space, and just repositioning of furniture and creating these little nooks and little environments for kids, and being able to best utilize the space that you do have. And every classroom is going to be different. And I think too, in terms of budget, for me, it didn't cost anything to push the desks in the hall just to get rid of them. That was a non-budget issue. It just created more floor space for the children. So when we think about cost and budget, I think it's important to think, well, what is it that you're going to buy? You don't necessarily need this endless budget. So I think that's important as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you've had anything in the same place for 5 years, it might be time to think about putting it somewhere else. I mean, it really is that easy, right? Like, go put Post-it notes everywhere in your classroom where that something hasn't moved in 5 years. From your desk to a poster to a something, and then start to say like, yeah, even I am tired of it being there. I need to do that around my own home sometimes, and pictures on the wall. I always tell my wife, be careful what we put up on the walls. It's going to be there for a decade. And, that just shouldn't be the case. And so, I think that's really important. And before, Greg, we were talking about, teachers visiting other classrooms. And I think that's huge. I love your rolling faculty meeting, Ben. That idea is fantastic. But to be honest with you, probably 50, 60, 70% of teachers in this country visit 2 schools a year. The one where they teach and one where their kids go to school. And that is why there's a breakdown and no ideas and no innovation, is because folks just aren't seeing trapped wisdom that's in the system.
I know when we did classroom cribs, and Erin can speak to this, but when we did classroom cribs and we started tweeting out and sharing some of the classrooms, and it was designed to be 2-minute YouTube videos. I mean, the hits on those videos were off the charts because teachers were actually finally getting a chance to check out some different classrooms from Iowa, from California. It didn't matter where it was. They had an opportunity to check out these different classrooms, and it was really interesting just to see how, I found a couple of the videos really insightful because of the way that the teacher had used natural lighting, and that's something that we don't even think enough about.
Yeah, and we always talk about we talk about traditional, and we all know that schools, they look very institutional, they smell very institutional, everything about them is in that very traditional mold. And Bob, I know you travel a lot, and you just came back from Alabama where you visited some schools. What are some really innovative things that you've seen in the last year in some of the schools you visited?
Yeah, and it's been interesting, Greg, and it has been fun. I was in Huntsville, Alabama. There's a teacher, Faith Plunkett, who has an incredible classroom that she basically cobbled together with this piece of this and this piece of that, and it's now become a model for the whole district. And this is one teacher taking the initiative, and her ability to have a vision for that has changed the whole system. I mean, they've built this incredible thing called the Entertainment Technology Academy. It's just fabulous to see. You go to a place like Charlottesville, Virginia, Pam Moran School District. They're doing incredible things at Albemarle County. Pam will tell you that no space is redesigned without 3 different ways for kids to sit in that classroom. I just think that that's a great, line in the sand. If we're going to redo this, let's redo it the right way. I've seen more and more classrooms that have had overhead power cords that can be pulled down that opens up the space. We're always stuck on where's the power going to be, where the power strip's going to be. And now I'm seeing all these classrooms that are putting in overhead power where you can just pull the cord down when you need it and you go with it from there. And so that's fun. But some of my favorite spaces are ones that are really still messy. They've said, we think we want to know what we're going to do with this, but it just hasn't evolved yet. We're just going to let it take its own shape. I think we get caught in that trap too, that it has to be really, really pretty and on display. And for folks to say, like, learning's messy, and we cleared this room out, and it's going to be coming, but we're not even sure what it's going to be yet. You wouldn't think that would be the most impressive, but some of those are the most impressive spaces I see.
Dillon, what are your thoughts?
Well, I can tell you probably for me, I have been to Kent Innovation, which is in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and what I loved about that space is the openness, the flexibility, but the one thing that really stuck out, and this is personally something that I do enjoy, when I go into a space and I can't tell where the front is. I tend to like that. I tend to like that there isn't a distinguished front in the room. And I also like it when sometimes I go into a classroom and I don't see a teacher desk. So I know that the teacher's moving, and that's part of what the classroom stands for. So those would be some things that have definitely caught my eye. Kent Innovation is one of the most says it right in the name, one of the most innovative spaces in Michigan. And it's up in Grand Rapids, and their project-based learning that they're doing, just the ability to have kids come in and just have a large voice in not only their learning but also the space is really remarkable.
And I've had some great guests on the Goin Digital Show in the last year. We've had Dwight Carter on talking about Clark Hall at the Ohio High School. That I know they get a lot of visitors each year. I've also had Glenn Robbins on with Idea Street in his middle school in New Jersey. And I think the common denominator in all these innovative school locations is they're just not afraid to try something new and take a risk. What's the worst thing that's going to happen if Idea Street doesn't work? You move the surfboards out of the hallway and you try something else. So what do you think, Bob, just in taking the plunge and trying something new?
Yeah, and it has to start with the leadership, right? And I think that's the key, is that if you have a leader that says, we're going to go do this, and starts to model that in a little way, it might mean your faculty meeting looks like you're standing up in the hallway as opposed to sitting in the library. But I do think it starts there, and I think that little things can multiply, but they have to multiply quickly. I mean, they have to be like little gremlins. You can't start something and then say, oh, we're starting this little pilot project over here, and 2-3 months later, that's the only pilot project. I think you have to have pilot projects that multiply on themselves really quickly. Otherwise, the momentum and the inertia just doesn't take hold. So I do say start small, but start small quickly and scale. I'd add to that.
I would, if I was to continue on with what Bob just said, what I have discovered here as the principal at Warner, bringing in parents and community members, because these spaces are going to look different than when parents and community members were in school themselves, and to show them the spaces and then to give them the why. When you start to have the community get on board and to say, yep, education has changed, that can be very powerful, because it then becomes more of a partnership, and it becomes more of how can we work together, because you're going to have a lot of parents that are going to want to support that because they're going to see the benefits to their own child's learning.
And Erin, what's the transition been like in your own classroom as an elementary school teacher? And I know you also taught at the middle school level, but go back, think back to when you started this idea of changing your learning space to today. How have attitudes changed?
I always share the example of when I first made the transition to go ditching the desks, when my students came in the room and I brought in artifacts from home and we muted our color scheme and we took all of the permanent environmental print off the walls, and we did this as a class together. I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, I must be really getting into the groove of teaching and have this classroom management thing under control, or I just have an amazing class this year and these children are wonderful. Like, I have to ask them, because I was so amazed. It was like a week. I just had like so many wonderful days in a row, and I asked my kids and I was like, guys, you are just phenomenal. What is going on? Like, what's changed? Because I don't want to mess it up. Let's not go back. And I remember the kids telling me, like, well, Mrs. Klein, we just like our new space. And they said, yeah, it's kind of like when you go to someone's house and it's really nice. Like, you know that you open the door and you have to take your shoes off and you just have to behave better. And one of the little kids chimed up, and I told this story before, but it's one of my favorites. And she said, Mrs. Klein, it's kind of like, when you go to McDonald's, you can run around and be crazy, but when you go to a nice restaurant like Applebee's, then you know that you have to behave, and you have to, really listen and have good manners. And, that's kind of stuck with me over the years, and I think it makes perfect sense, because I think we as adults can relate to that. I know when I walk into a spa to get a massage, I feel differently, and the environment looks different. There's a certain tone set for when you walk into that space, as opposed to when I walk into a Chuck E. Cheese for a birthday party. Whoa, it's overstimulation, noise, or a casino. We know these environments that make us feel certain ways, and I purposely avoid certain restaurants because I might love the food. That's why I get takeout from there, because I cannot stand the environment. And I think that as adults, we can certainly relate to that. So the transition for me in terms of once you explain that to parents, it's been complete buy-in and they get it, because when you ask them, when you have a group project to work on or when you're collaborating, and a lot of our parents have been students themselves in school, in college, finishing degrees, and oh yeah, we just go to Starbucks and we meet up, or we go to one of the popular restaurants that has a private room and we can sit and enjoy each other's conversation in a casual way, but also really dig deep into our work. I think that that's important, and they really start to get it and find meaning in how the space affects the learning as well.
Bob, is this going to eventually become the norm in schools as we think about the future?
Well, I am always the optimist, but I do know that this is still a fringe thing that's happening, right? I still think we're talking about 10, 15% of folks that are really thinking about this. That's the unfortunate part. My answer is I hope so, but the reality of what we're looking at right now, it's not at a tipping point where it's happening everywhere. What I do hope is that learning space design doesn't become the next computer lab, and it doesn't become the next interactive whiteboard, right? I really do think that we have a need to be intentional around this work, and I think that I'm dedicated to it. And I think I'm going to continue to write about it and continue to talk about it while I'm out on the road. And I think there'll be many, many more blog posts and books coming from me, so I can share this out and hopefully scale it and make it bigger.
So Ben, what's the goal for you as the principal in your building? Do you think, by a certain date or a certain year, you're going to have 80% of your classrooms are going to look different, or I guess the goal would be 100%, right?
Well, goodness, I would say we're probably at that 80% right now. I feel pretty good about some of our spaces. I think the one thing that we can do here is have them be more flexible so that they change more during the year. Our seating is able to change. But the other thing is, I guess one of my big goals is getting teachers out to see different spaces. And I think the more that I can show them different spaces, the more their creativity and their imagination and the possibilities will take over, and then they come back and they give that voice and that choice to kids, and they involve them in the process. So between them having a larger scope of seeing things, and also between involving the kids more, I think then our spaces can really fully develop. I would also say, and I think it's this time of year, an underutilized space is outdoors, and I would say that around the country, even if you're, could as a PTO or a PTA, could you come up with some type of an outdoor space where kids can learn outdoors as well? Or maybe you don't even need to have a designated space, and kids go out there and they can explore in nature. So I know Dave Tebow in the Hamilton School District in Michigan does quite a bit with outdoor spaces. But I would just say to teachers, especially as the weather's getting nicer around the country, expand your viewpoint. It doesn't necessarily have to be the classroom. It can also be outdoors as well.
And Bob, as we think about technology and your role as a technology director, are there any particular things we need to think about in designing classrooms differently from maybe a one-to-one standpoint?
A couple things. One, certainly being intentional again. And so what we know is if you put a huge cart in the middle of a redesigned classroom space that has 30 laptops in it, that's taking up a bunch of square feet that could be more innovative. So anything you can do to minimize the footprint of the devices in the room, I think it goes a long way. So we know that having extra desktops that get used once a week for some games in the corner isn't going to get it done. Having a big, big cart in there, cart on wheels, big cow in there, if you would, isn't going to do it either. So being very thoughtful about that. And, I've seen some really creative folks and how they put their devices away with a small footprint, whether those are iPads or Chromebooks or whatever they are in those classrooms. And, I think that's really important. And then we see all kinds of classrooms that have audio and video creation stations within them, portable green screens that can be popped up. So thinking about how can you use your room as a creation studio is also a piece of the puzzle.
Well, we've had a great conversation tonight with Bob Dillon, Ben Gilpin, and Erin Klein, and you certainly want to follow these folks on Twitter, read their blogs, and you certainly want to get the book. I'm sure it's going to be a great read, and it's out now, right? May of 2016. So right now you can run out and get that. It's part of the Corwin Educator Series. It's easy to find online. So as we wrap it up tonight, if the three of you could just give us a closing thought, tell us where we can find you on Twitter, and anything else you want to share with the group. And we'll start with Erin.
So I think closing thoughts are just think intentionally about what you do. I think that's most important. And you can find me on kleinspiration.com or at KleinErin on Twitter. Thanks.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, I have fun with this, right? Like we were all kind of serious about this all night, but this can actually add a lot of energy and a lot of fun to a space and a lot of play. So I think that learning space design is about all of those things, energy and fun and play. So make sure that you're allowing that to happen. I hate to say make it happen when you talk about those things, but allow it to happen. So, and you can find me on Twitter at IdeaGuy42 or drrobertdillon.com.
Great. Ben?
Thanks, Greg.
Well, Bob brings up something about the, sometimes we can get real serious about this stuff. I 100% am all about 100% kids first. I'm 100% student centric. I will say that when we started to do this, one of the parts that I loved more than anything else as a building principal is watching the culture really come to life here at Warner Elementary, watching teachers working together, painting together, telling stories. That to me, that's when everything seemed to really start to change here at Warner, is when the teachers started really working together on this entire building project. And if you're an administrator, if you're a leader, if you're a teacher and you're in a culture that maybe is dragging you down, something like this where you're working together with someone can really start to turn things around and change things, because it brings a lot of energy to a space, and that would be my advice. Look into this as not only something that can really change the learning, but also something that can uplift the culture as well. And if you're looking for me on Twitter, it's at Benjamin Gilpin, and I also blog at you can find me at bengilpin.com. So thank you.
Ben, before I let you go, one of the things I found in doing some research on you, I love the vines that you put out. You try to spend a lot of time getting quality video in your school district. How long have you been doing that? And tell us how that's another way to tell your school story.
Well, the key really is that 10 to 15 seconds. Keep them short and sweet, and show off some of those spaces. A lot of people like those real short little videos and pictures as well. So on a daily basis, I really try hard to get a couple of pictures, a couple of short little videos, just to kind of give some snapshots of things that are going on here at Warner Elementary and to tell that positive story.
Well, great. And again, thank you to all of our guests. This has been episode number 17, and we've been talking about how to redesign classrooms. Be sure to get the book. Again, that's part of the Corwin series, and be sure to follow these folks on Twitter, and definitely read the blogs. All three of these individuals have fascinating insight into all types of things related to K-12 education. So with that, I want to thank you for listening tonight, watching live on the TeachCal Network, and be sure to look for this episode and other episodes coming soon on Stitcher Radio and iTunes. So with that, good night and have a wonderful evening.